and safety of the individual. Our supportive services, which they are tailored a bit with the pandemic and everything. I have sent Sarah our current services that we're offering, so you guys will get that after the webinar. The first one is 24-hour hotline. That you guys can call anytime. A lot of times people just think it's only for crisis situations. That's not the case. Say if you're working with a client or a family member and you need support or resources, give us a call. That's not an issue. We have a shelter. Our shelter is for intimate partner violence, women and children. So we're still doing the shelter, still doing the hotline. We have counseling and therapy, which right now we're doing counseling and therapy phone-based. So that is still an option for individuals if they're seeking, some sort of support. We do have support groups. Our support group we have is intimate partner violence support group and also trauma-informed yoga. So that is something we are doing. So if you do have questions, give us a call on hotline. Medical advocacy. So our medical advocacy is phone-based right now. But if we have a request from the hospital that the individual would like us to come in, there is a chance we're able to come in. But with the medical advocacy, we go out to the local hospitals for support. So a victim of domestic violence, sexual violence, or sex trafficking, we get called out for. And again, we're there to support, give them resources, let them know we're here, and help them in any way we can. Legal advocacy. So some of that we're still doing on the phone. With legal advocacy, we help at the Protection from Abuse office. So we currently have somebody there now assisting with temporary PFAs. And we also are helping with permanent PFAs. So if you know somebody that is going through that or have clients, please tell them to reach out to us. We'll give them support. We'll kind of guide them, to what to expect, give them some options if they're unsure. We also do police interviews. We will do district attorney interviews if that would be the case. I know a lot of that's being done through WebEx and all that, but that is an option. So please have them reach out to us. And then we offer community education programs. So we're in the school K through 12. We are doing different topics from, healthy relationships, dating, violence, consent, and it is tailored. So we have this tailored to the age group. Good touch, bad touch, all that kind of stuff. And then we're also in the universities too, talking about dating, violence, and stalking, all those different topics. And then we offer student awareness programs. So if you guys have questions, you can ask me, at the end of the webinar. If not, give us a call. Don't hesitate. And just so you know, we provide services to men, women, and children. It's confidential. It's provided at no cost. So please, keep that in mind. Okay, so real quick, I'll go through the objectives so everybody kind of just has an idea of what we'll be talking about today. So you'll get an understanding of what domestic violence is and the complexities it entails. We'll understand the correlation between domestic violence and substance abuse. We'll be able to identify various ways perpetrators use substance abuse coercion in domestic violence relationships. We'll be able to understand how trauma affects domestic violence and substance abuse, and we'll be able to identify supportive strategies when working with victims of domestic violence and substance abuse. So let's get into understanding domestic violence. Like I said before, it is complex. There's a lot of different factors with domestic violence. And when we talk about that today, a lot of people think, well, let's just focus on women. Well, no, it happens to anybody. It doesn't matter the gender, the nationality, if you're low income, high income, it doesn't discriminate. So kind of keep that in mind when you're working with clients too, that understanding of, it could happen to anybody. And, we're always say about what happens in the home stays in a home. So a lot of times you're not aware of what's going on. So domestic violence is a pattern of behaviors used by one partner to maintain power and control over another partner in an intimate relationship. That's through the National Domestic Violence Hotline. There are different definitions, but the reason why I chose this one is because we're really going to be focusing on intimate partner violence relationships. A lot of times in domestic violence, it could be within the family. So it could be siblings, it could be parents and children, it could be grandparents, so that can also be considered domestic violence, but we're going to be focusing on the IPV, intimate partner violence relationship. So important terminology before we get started, because I have a tendency to use this and sometimes people will say, well, what are you talking about? So we're going to go over this, but as I mentioned before, intimate partner violence, IPV, I'll use that a lot. Power and control, we'll talk about, cycle of abuse, reproductive coercion. And I threw in there victim and survivor because a lot of times people will ask, what do you use? Do you use victim? Do you use survivor? I'm going to be saying them both. And to be honest, there's no correct answer. It's up to the individual. And sometimes they don't want to be called either of those. So just kind of keeping that in mind. And then we'll be talking about abusers and perpetrators. So since I'll be talking about abuse, I will sometimes use perpetrators too. So just so everybody's aware. Okay, cycle of abuse. This is really important. I know many of you already know about the cycle of abuse, but I think it's important when you're working with clients, especially with substance use disorder, to have an understanding of what the cycle of abuse is. So first stage, there's 3 stages. The first one is the honeymoon. Honeymoon is what? The romantic gestures, you know, buying gifts, cooking dinner, going out to eat. Well, in this situation, nobody's going out to eat. So maybe cooking dinner, going for walks, things like that. Everything's great, right, in the honeymoon phase. A lot of times people ask, well, how long does that last? No answer. It could last weeks, months, years. We had a client where the abuse didn't start until they were married. So kind of keep that in mind. It doesn't happen right away. It does take time. So from the honeymoon phase, you have the tension building. Tension building, you hear a lot of walking on eggshells. Perfect example of that. You know, the victim doesn't know what's going on, but they know they don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to say anything wrong to upset the partner. They watch what they do, right? So that's the tension building phase, which leads into the explosion phase. So they don't do anything wrong, but that partner explodes. And it's not just physical. A lot of times people think, oh, it's physical abuse. It could be financial. It could be verbal. They could do something that just was scary. It was triggering, right? It became dangerous for that individual. So you have the explosion phase. Well, after the explosion phase, usually the partner will say, especially if it's early on, I'm done, right? I'm not going back to this. So they leave or they kick the person out. But then comes the apologies. And this is the big thing. When you're working with a client, especially with substance use disorder, maybe, you know, you guys are talking and they bring up about how there was a fight going on, you know, between one another. And then they mention about a week later, they're back together, right? They broke up. Now they're back together because we get that a lot. Because the reason why they're back together is because they apologized. They said, you know, I'm sorry, but you know I'm jealous, or I'm sorry, but you shouldn't have said that. And so you hear from the victim in that situation say, well, I probably shouldn't have said that, or, you know, I knew better not to say that. I knew they were upset. Well, keep that in mind because a lot of times with that apology, it's never a real apology, right? It gets flipped. It's, yes, I'm apologizing, but it's your fault too. So that kind of leads back into the honeymoon phase where everything is starting to get back to normal. So the partner forgives them, they're back together, you know, everything's going great, but then it goes back to the tension building in time. One thing before we go to the next slide, I want to bring up about this. When you start to notice the honeymoon phase is decreasing, keep an eye on that because eventually in time, in really, you know, dangerous situations, honeymoon phase starts to go out, right? And then it's the tension building and explosion. When you start seeing that and not seeing the honeymoon phase, be careful because that's when it becomes dangerous. So abuse and violence are issues of, now we talked about this, this was in the definition. So what is it, right? Power and control. So keep that in mind. With power and control, it's all about manipulation, taking control off of that person. A lot of times people will say, especially with substance use disorder, when that's in the relationship, it's the alcohol, it's the drugs that are causing that. Well, it might escalate it, it might make it worse, but it doesn't cause the abuse. So keep that in mind. Ultimately, it's about power and control. It's about getting in that person's mind and controlling them. So what I mean by that is, you know, when they're out on their own or if they go out to the grocery store, if they're hanging out with friends, they're constantly thinking about, well, I can't do this because of so-and-so, or I need to watch doing this because I don't want to upset them. They can't think for themselves anymore. And again, this takes time for them to get to that point, but that's what perpetrators do. They take power and control off of an individual. So there are many types of abuse. Financial, you have sexual, you have emotional, you have verbal, you have physical. One thing to keep in mind is a lot of times people say physical is the worst, right? That's the most severe. Many victims have said to us, what really is worse for me is the verbal, because bruises will go away, but the words that are said, they stick with you day in and day out. So kind of keep that in mind. And again, these types of abuse, it could be financial and verbal and physical. It could be all these different types that an individual is going through, and we won't even know it, right? So we talked about domestic violence. I gave you, the basic information of things to keep in mind when you're working with individuals. So substance use disorder. We can't say domestic violence causes, substance use disorder, or substance use disorder causes domestic violence. There's been a ton of research. There's nothing that concrete I can say, yes, that's what's going on. That isn't the case. But we do know that there's a connection. There's an overlap. And when we talk about this more, you're going to see that. So I really like this. It's 40 to 60% of domestic violence incidents involve substance abuse. You can see it's from the American Society of Addiction. I know it's from 2014, and I know it's 6 years ago. But just think about that. Let's say 50%. Back then, 50% they had of domestic violence incidents involve substance abuse. So that was 6 years ago. We're in 2020 now. Imagine how that increased. And, it's still not even being talked about like it should be. So a lot of it goes unreported. So that's 50% 2014. So kind of just think that out. All right, so let's connect the pieces. When we talked about domestic violence and substance use disorder, we talked about how there's an overlap, there's a connection. So we're going to talk about that right now. Domestic violence. So as I talked about before, with domestic violence, a loss of control, right? They feel like they're not in control. They feel shame. They feel guilt. And let me just say this. They're not going to say this while they're in the relationship. They may say a couple of these things, but it's usually when they finally start seeing, it's time for me. I deserve better. It's time for me to get out. That's when they start looking back and seeing these words, these emotions that they're feeling during that relationship. So they have that loss of control. They have the shame. They have the guilt. Identity. Who are they anymore? Because the perpetrator, that's who they are now. He took control of them. So they're really not themselves, which their self-esteem, they don't have any self-esteem. So keeping that in mind. Isolation. So the supports, their family, their friends, a lot of times they're no longer there because they just can't deal with it, and I get where the family supports are, but that's what really a person in a domestic violence relationship needs. Denial. That's a big thing. Stages of grief, we all know that everyone has to go through that, but denial in a domestic violence relationship is huge. I don't know about you guys, but when you work with a lot of your clients, I'm sure, you've worked with some that you suspect there's some domestic violence going on. If you would say to them, which I don't recommend doing, but if you would say to them, it sounds like domestic violence, a lot of times until they're ready, they're going to say, what? No, that's not domestic violence. I shouldn't have done that. Or I should have just listened, or, they make excuses, and that's understandable because they're in that relationship. When we're outside looking in, we could say a lot of things they should do, but we're not them. So again, denial, powerless, but trauma. So we're going to talk about trauma a little bit later, but with the trauma piece in domestic violence relationships, we're finding, a large percentage have some sort of trauma in their past, whether it's, growing up in a domestic violence home, right, where there was violence always going on, or, if there was some sort of abuse maybe in their first relationship, or, we'll get into that more, but there's something that has happened. Now, I'm not going to say with every victim, but majority of the time we see that there has been trauma. So that's domestic violence. Substance use disorder. So let's look at that. With substance use disorder, let's go through all these words again. Loss of control, right? Shame and guilt. Identity. Who are they? Who are they anymore, really? Isolation. So all those supports they had before, they're gone, right? Because they can't deal with this anymore. Or maybe they're isolating themselves because they don't want their family or their friends to find out what's going on. Self-esteem, you know, when they're thinking about life and where they're going to go and things like that. Who are they? Powerless. Again, they're not the ones in control of their life. That drug, that alcohol is the one that's controlling their life. Denial. Again, with denial. A lot of times you hear a lot of people say when they have substance use disorder about denial. I didn't believe it. I was in denial. They will say that a lot, and I'm sure you guys have heard it. So, when you're looking at all this, there's that similarity, the overlap, and of course, trauma. I can't say that every individual that has substance use disorder has trauma, but again, a high percentage has. And we'll get into that, whether it's a loss of a loved one or maybe there has been some sort of abuse, things like that. They've experienced that. And so with substance use disorder, maybe, they started using first and then they met somebody, in that clique and they got in a relationship with them. And then that's when the domestic violence started. Or maybe what happened was they were in a domestic violence relationship. They couldn't deal with it. So they turned towards drugs and alcohol to cope because they want to numb the pain. They don't want to deal with reality. Or, all these feelings come into play. That's a lot to deal with when you don't have supports, when you don't know where to turn. So kind of keeping that in mind, there is a big connection between the two. So nearly 80% of domestic violence crimes are related to the use of drugs. 80%. That's a large percentage. And that's from the Addiction Center. So again, my references are going to be sent out so you guys can look at all that. But think about that. Domestic violence crimes. And we know that a lot of times that individuals don't call the police if there's fighting going on, especially if that victim knows that they were using or there's drugs in the home. They're not going to call because they don't want to get in trouble. Or if they have kids, they don't want CYS involved if they're not already involved, because that's a fear, losing their kids. So these all play a role, but that's a large percentage. So have you heard of substance use coercion? So this is something that not a lot of people talk about, but it really is important to focus on. So there's many different types of substance use coercion. We're going to go through some of these and talk them out. So whether the perpetrator introduces the person to drugs and alcohol, which we do see. They start out in a relationship, let's have fun, let's do drugs, let's just live it up, right? Or have a drink. Maybe they're not used to drinking. The victim never drank before. Well, here, have some, right? So that's one way. Challenge sanity and sobriety. That's another way, and that's a big one. We do see that a lot, and I'm sure you guys do as well. Whether that be, playing mind games with them. So putting out a bottle, they know that they can't resist. So putting a bottle right in front of them, or putting drugs throughout the house where they know they can see it. They know it's right there. So it's kind of like taunting them, like, oh, are you going to do it? And it does. It questions your sobriety. And then you start thinking, oh my gosh, am I losing my mind? Sabotage recovery. Again, so they want to sabotage that recovery because it takes power off of them. It takes the individual feels like that's all they have, right? So they're going to go towards it because that's the only thing I have. One example of that is, it was a client that I worked with a few years ago. This individual was finally in rehab. And a couple days in, when I was talking to this individual, they had said that their partner was calling them and saying, I don't think you really love me, because they had kids too. So the individual was taking care of the kids. I don't think you really love me. You're leaving me with the kids. I think I'm going to move on. I can't do this, right? And that was 3 days into rehab. This person was saying this to this individual. Well, this person is trying to get their life on track. They're trying to do better. What partner is going to say that if you truly care about somebody? But then while they're at rehab, they're thinking about, I'm going to lose my kids. I'm going to lose my house because they live together. I'm going to lose the person I love. Even though it's a love-hate relationship with domestic violence, they have feelings for them. I can't lose them. That's all I have. That's all I have. So they ended up leaving. And I don't know what ended up coming from it, but the person left, and it just, that's the way that they work. Perpetrators work. They know how to control an individual. So keep that in mind. And then we have control there. Control is many things, but access to treatment is another big one. So maybe transportation, maybe they don't drive. So my partner has to take me. Well, the partner may say, the night before, if you don't start acting right, or if you don't start doing this better, I'm not taking you tomorrow, or I'm not going to take you the rest of the week. Right? So these are the tactics they use. And when you're working with someone, so for those of you that are substance use counselors, when you're working with someone that may call you and say, I'm sorry, I couldn't make it, I couldn't get a ride, or I'm sorry, my partner couldn't take me, things like that, keep that in mind, because if you start hearing that more and more, they're using that as leverage. So they know that they have to act this certain way the partner wants. So they have no control. And we are seeing too, we're seeing a lot of partners with human trafficking. So human traffickers are the partners in the relationship. So again, what they'll say is, to throw this in, they'll say, if you want your methadone or Suboxone, you have to do this sex act because we need money for rent, or to get food, whatever the case may be. So again, they're saying, if you don't do this, then you're not going there. So they do that because they want to go. They want to go and they want to get treatment. So that's the leverage they use. Again, undermine. When I say undermine, I mean undermine the ability to maintain custody. So a lot of times, if there are kids involved, and if the partner, the abuser, maybe doesn't have substance use disorder, they target that person. So they say, well, who's going to believe you? You know, and they say horrible things, which I'm not going to say, but they say horrible things to be demeaning, to bring them down. And you know what? That victim starts to believe them. Well, they're right. I use drugs, who is going to believe me? And they say everything. And the partner, the perpetrator in this relationship, threatens them with the kids. That's a huge tactic we see a lot of times. So nothing's said, nothing's done. And it kind of keeps them where they are and keeps them isolated. Reproductive coercion. So this is not talked about enough. Just an example so you guys know what reproductive coercion is. It's, taking birth control, or maybe swapping out birth control with something else and your partner has no idea, or not using protection, giving that person STDs, unintended, pregnancies. These are a lot of things. And with substance abuse going on in the relationship, we see a lot of, sabotaging recovery, or getting that person to a point where they really don't know what's going on. So the victim, they'll give them alcohol or drugs. Hey, let's party tonight, right? They'll do it, they'll take it. Well, that perpetrator knows then they can take advantage of them. So maybe they won't use protection. They'll have sexual intercourse and there's no protection. So that leaves them open to pregnancies, STDs, things like that. And if they do get a person pregnant, again, that's control, because then they say to them, well, and I'm using this because this is what we hear, you're an addict, you only have me, I'm your only support, I'm here for you, right? So they feel like they're alone, they stick with the perpetrator even more. And and then the child's growing up in this environment. But that's what the tactics that the perpetrators use, the abusers use. Forced dependency. That's something else that, it's pretty self-explanatory that they force that upon them. They make them take drugs, or they make them drink, and then they're dependent upon it. And so again, the control, that individual has no control, the perpetrator does. And so then that way, by them having control, that person's never going to leave in their mind. Once they start losing control, that's when it becomes extremely dangerous for the victim. So keep that in mind. So if you're working with somebody that has substance use disorder and you suspect there's domestic violence going on, and you notice there's a lot more fights going on within the home, or arguments, and they start telling you some of these arguments of what they are, and maybe the partner's scared that they're going to get clean before them, or they're going to leave them, things like that. Those are some red flags that there's more going on, and there's that control piece, and they feel that they're losing that control. So the importance of understanding trauma. This is so important, especially, putting aside if we're just focusing on domestic violence, or if we're just focusing on substance use disorder. It's so important to understand trauma when working with individuals. So as many of you already know, the 3 E's of trauma. At Blackburn Center, we use the trauma-informed approach with each client. Going in, once you get to that door, we're being trauma-informed, because that really does make a difference for an individual, for a client. So the first one, as we all know, is the event. So when I talk about trauma today, yes, I'm talking about if somebody's in a domestic violence relationship or has substance use disorder and has been through something, but I'm also looking at it as a child too, because like I said before, they've experienced, for the most part, not all, but many victims have experienced some sort of trauma, whether it's a loss of a loved one, a natural disaster, assault, whether it's a one-time thing or multiple incidents they've experienced. That's the event they've experienced. So the experience from them is going to be different, right? It's different for each person. And I know for some people it's kind of hard to wrap their head around the experience. If someone's in a domestic violence relationship and they just got in a fight, right, and the perpetrator really did a number on this individual, they find it hard. Why don't they leave? You know, why don't they just leave? If that was me, I'd leave. Well, again, we don't walk in their shoes. We don't understand, and their experience is going to be different. You know, maybe this isn't the first time it's happened. Maybe they growing up, they were used to this kind of violence. So this is all they expect, or this is all they know. So again, to them, it's every day. So it's nothing, it's not surprising them. It's not shocking. So understanding that everyone's experience is different. And then the effect, what the outcome is. So for some, if there was an assault, you know, especially sexual assault in an intimate partner violence relationship, when drugs are involved, a lot of times they don't report, because again, we hear, you know, the victim blaming of, well, you did drink, you know, how much you drank, or what did you have on? You know, we hear that a lot, and we hear it from friends, family, right? We hear it from everybody. So the effect that person has is going to be different. For some, this might not be the first time it's happened to them. So that effect, they may laugh, because just to deal with things, how they cope, that's the way they cope. For others, they may cry. Some, they're numb, right? There's no emotion because they're in shock. So, you know, it takes time, and each person's so different. So just like with domestic violence and substance use disorder, when you have those two blended, like mixed together, and that overlap, and you have that client, keep that in mind, because certain things that even though we may think, well, you know, should they be acting this way, or, you know, why don't they just leave? Things like that. There's a lot of reasons why. And so we're going to get into childhood trauma really briefly, because this does play a role. You know, why, you know, someone may use in the future, or why someone got into a violent relationship, and it's not their fault. Let's keep that in mind. It's not the victim's fault. So childhood trauma, a lot of times we call complex trauma, right? So victims face at a young age broken trust, betrayal. Those are big. Those are huge. When children, you know, are faced with that, when they experience that, the violence, manipulation, you know, abuse, the threats, things like that, when they're growing up in that environment, you know, that leaves long-lasting effects, and emotional effects is anxiety, as we know, depression, PTSD, disassociation. We see a lot when there has been sexual abuse in the past. You know, they try and just get away from it, get in a whole nother reality than what they're living in right now. There's just so many different emotions. So when you're working with somebody that has domestic violence or suspected domestic violence and substance use disorder, we got to keep in mind that trauma that they're bringing too, you know, because it's not just a one shoe fits all. We know that with clients, it's so situational. You know, we're not going to offer the same exact services to that same person, even though their situation's similar. You know, you're going to have to do something different to get them where they need to be. So supportive strategies when working with a victim of domestic violence. When I talk about this, and I mention this throughout, it's really important. You know, and to be honest, not all the time is it going to work right then and there. So if I give you these and you go do them, they may not work. Because again, you got to remember, it's up to that individual. You have to see if they're ready. Just like with substance use disorder, it's up to them. They have to be ready. If they're not ready, you can do everything you can, right? It's not going to work. And I know that's tough to hear, but with what we do, we have to remind ourselves of that. You know, we love to save people, but we can't. So we just got to meet them where they are. So supportive strategies, there's 4 of them. I'm going to talk about these because it is important to hear. And, for those of you, you may already know this, but just kind of keep in mind, it's, a refresher. Trauma informed, like we talked about. Like I said, when an individual comes through that door, we're trauma informed. We meet them where they are. Mutual playing ground field. We don't act as if, hey, we're up here, you're down here, and I know none of you do that, but that does play a role. We're all equals, and we're there to help each other and support one another. Assess. So assess is really big, and on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about that, which I know a lot of you are already doing, is, assessing the situation, but how we assess it. So again, we go back to trauma informed, right? Are our questions trauma informed that we're asking clients? Because we do that too with our intakes when we're working with clients. We always are looking at that, making sure, is that going to be triggering, or is how we're saying that, is that appropriate? Is that trauma informed? So really reevaluating that. Unique needs. So again, I brought up situational. Everything is situational. So one shoe does not fit all. And, when we talk about different services that we have to offer for an individual, that's when collaboration comes into part. You have to look at it such as maybe somebody has mental health, substance use disorder. They need a victim service agency because of domestic violence. And then maybe they need housing. They're not a fit for the domestic violence shelter, but they need housing. Whereas somebody else doesn't need housing, but they're pregnant. Kind of looking at all these different factors. And what we do know is, if we meet somebody where they're at, right, as much as, we want them to get to, just like with substance use disorder, you have to meet them where they are. You can't jump ahead. You have to meet them right there. So if you're working with them and they're still on step 1 and it's been a couple weeks, keep taking that time with them, because for somebody that may have started the same time they started, they could be on step 5 by then, right? But for others, they may be on step 2 or 3 or still at 1. It's all situational. But we know if we jump ahead and they're not ready, what's going to happen, right? They're just going to go back to that situation. They're just going to go back to those emotions we talked about, feeling guilt, shame, sense of self. They don't know who they are. So we really got to take our time and focus on that. And that's why it's so important to work together and understand those unique needs and do that, the assessment and everything. So are you screening for domestic violence? So I did put a couple questions in there just for everybody to kind of look at, but think about the questions you ask. For those of you that are substance use counselors, when you have somebody coming in, what are your screening questions? Are they trauma informed? When do you ask those questions? Is it right away when they come in? Do you get to know them a little bit? Take into account all these different factors. So the first one, has your partner ever made you, hold on 1 second, let me do this. Has your partner ever made you use alcohol or drug, or were you threatened by them if you did not use, right? So these are all things that can lead to abuse, or is abuse going on? Another question is, has your partner ever prevented you from attending a recovery meeting or interfered with your treatment? So these are just questions, and I'm not saying you have to use them, but it is something where we know that when there's substance use disorder, and a lot of you already know this too, there's a high chance that domestic violence is going on, and vice versa. When we work with individuals, with domestic violence, we check for that. We talk to them because there is a big possibility that there is substance use going on, and we understand that if we're working on domestic violence and getting them the supports they need in the counseling and the therapy, but if they're still, there's still addiction, they're still in the relationship, because we still work with them even if they're in the relationship. We help them safety plan, we help them figure out what their next steps are. But if they're not focusing on, getting treatment, moving forward with that aspect of the substance abuse that they have going on, what's really going to change? We all have to work together in order to get everybody on the same page. So if there is domestic violence, we want them also to be able to reach out to supports for substance use. So then that way they're working on two of those, and they're just not focusing on one, because in order to succeed, they need to focus on everything. And then collaboration. So as you guys already know, there's trauma therapy. Most likely there may be trauma therapy is needed. Victim service agency. And please reach out to us. When I say victim service agency, we get called out if you're working with a client and there is suspected abuse going on and they want to talk to us. We'll come out and meet. We meet them where they are. We don't expect them to leave the relationship, but we'll give them resources, because it may not be safe for them to call us. because the perpetrator may be checking their phone, or come to our office because they check their mileage, or they make sure that they go there and they come back within a certain amount of time. Mental health support, we know that's really big. Rehab for substances, medical care, housing assistance is huge, legal assistance, criminal justice. So, if there has been charges, maybe they have felonies on their, on their criminal record, kind of looking at all the different puzzle pieces that need to go together in order to get them and move them forward. So that is, basically just a quick overview of domestic violence and substance use disorder and the connection between them. I know you guys have questions, so let me go to where I need to go to see what questions you guys have. I know that, look at the chat box. Do we have any questions? Am I missing that? Please ask me anything. I'll do my best to answer.
It looks like
Two. Okay. Okay, so let me go. Great question. So this is Robert Arrett. Do you have a link between your organization and ours and other behavioral problems? So I'm assuming what you mean is by a link is collaboration. And yes, we do. We would love to, connect even more to build on that. Hold on, let me just make sure. Let me pull up the chat. Oh, sorry. So yes, so we do work with, we're on various boards to work with them and to work together, because we know how important collaboration is. And we know that, just because we're a domestic violence center doesn't mean we are the end all be all. We need everybody on board. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you for that. And then the next one is, what is the percentage of domestic violence in Westmoreland County? That's from Debbie. So Debbie, I wish I could give you that answer. We don't have that, but what I can say is, even if we did have that, it probably wouldn't be accurate, because it's so hard to get a true number on that, statistic around that, because a lot of it goes unreported. What we're seeing too is, if they do call the police, sometimes they're both being charged. I mean, there's a lot of factors that play a role, so I don't have that exact answer for you. I wish I did, but for the most part, it's a high percentage. And just to kind of throw in there too, with our hotline, we do get a lot of calls from anonymous callers, and it's individuals that say, I don't want to say my name, I don't want to say who I am, which is fine, but it's situations and stories that that no one's ever going to know, because they're just telling us, but it's unbelievable that it's even going on. Thank you, Debbie, and I think we may have some more questions. So okay, what is the youngest age of clients you have served? Blackburn Center, I know it's hard to hear, but we have served children. So we used to serve 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds, but then we decided therapy, we'll see 4 and 5-year-olds, and then we'll see 6 and up. So for counseling, we'll see 6 and up. Therapy, we'll see 4 and 5-year-olds. So that's the youngest we have seen. Now, we have had at our shelter newborns come in, but we don't provide those services. They're just there staying with us. Thank you, Teresa. And then Lori, are you seeing an increase in calls in the light of the pandemic? Thank you for bringing that up. So what's interesting is, I wish I could say yes to this, but it's a wave. Our hotline has been a wave, between evening calls, getting no calls, to the morning getting a ton of calls. And the reason why we're finding this out is because the perpetrator's home. So if they're laid off, they're not working, they're home now. So they don't have the opportunity to call us. So we're getting a lot of calls where, right then in the moment is the only time they can talk to us. So I have to answer that with no, but there's a reason why we're not getting an increase in call, and it's because they're home. So thank you for that. Judith, is the shelter still operating during the stay-at-home order, or do you have to make other arrangements for people? So yes, we still are sheltering intimate partner violence victims. We're still doing that. It's a little bit different now how we're sheltering them, because social distancing, things like that, but we are still offering that. So if you know somebody or you're working with someone, tell them to give us a call on hotline. We'll do our best. We'll work with them, see what we can do for them. And then Jamie, doesn't the name come up on caller ID? Is it truly anonymous? Good question. So what we do is, anytime we talk to anybody, If we're able to call them back, we always ask, do you want us to block our number or unblock our number? So if they say it is safe and maybe the user doesn't check their phone, we'll unblock our number. But most cases, it does come up blocked, because we have a lot of clients say, you haven't called us. And we say, well, we blocked our number. And they said, oh, we forgot. So yes, it does come up blocked. Any other questions? Thank you guys for these. All right, let's see. Teresa, can transportation help be provided for victims to get to your center? That's a great question. And to be honest, we're still kind of figuring all that out. For the most part, yes. We've been working with, Uber has been great. We've got vouchers from them. We've got a couple different resources that we can get clients if they can't get to our where they need to be. I can't say where, but if they can't get to the place, we'll figure something out to get them there. So yes, to Teresa. Marsha, do you have any programs to talk to teens regarding awareness of domestic violence? Yes, we do. Education department. I'm in advocacy. I'm the assistant advocacy program manager, so I don't do that part, but we do have an education program manager that talks about that. So if that's something you're interested in, I'm sure she would love to talk to you. So I can, if you want to give me a call, email me, I can get you connected with Kristen. So thank you. What is the other one? What do you do with hangups on hotline? Is it like 911 and you give a call back to check status? Really good question. Unfortunately, we do not. So if they do call us and they hang up, we don't call back because we don't know if it's safe. Because a lot of times when that happens, we don't know, but we suspect that the perpetrator has come into the room or it's unsafe for them to talk. So that's why we don't call back, but we hope that they do call us back when they can. But we try and answer the hotline too, after 2 rings. We're on it as best as we can be. Amy Jo, I have a few clients that would have utilized your services. However, they are in a methadone maintenance program and daily dosing is important for them. But without transportation, this isn't an option. Can something be considered in the future? Wonderful question, Amy. So just throwing this out there, we actually can come out, and it's up to you guys. I don't want to overstep, but if that's something where right now they're in a maintenance program and they're somewhere safe and they want to talk to us, we can schedule a time to come out. I've done it before where I've come out and just talk to them, see where they are, just kind of get a feel and just let them take the lead. So that is an option. You just would need to call us. You can contact me. I can come out. That's not a problem. Or somebody else can come out and talk to them. And then Donna, do you ever have to call 911 on situations? Thankfully, I don't want to jinx it, but right now, no. But I will say it's happened before where we may have had to take care of some things because perpetrators unfortunately use tracking systems on cars, track their phones. Unfortunately they're smart, so they have tactics to find where the victim is, the survivor now, and they do what they have to do to try and find this person. So right now, thankfully, no, but it has happened where we had to. Any other questions? These are great questions, so thank you guys. And like I said before, not to be repetitive, but please, if you have a client or have family or friends that may be going through something and you just want to talk, you can call us. You don't have to give your name. You can give us a call, but I will say we are mandated reporters of child abuse, or if you report harm to yourself or harm to someone else. So if you talk to somebody, let them know that they can give us a call at any time. We'll do our best to help them as best as we can.
I don't think there's any, so far, no more questions, but wow, that was some really great stuff, Renee. Thank you so much for doing this. This is good resources.
Thank you.
Yeah. And we will send out those 3 documents to everybody, the resource documents that you sent me. And if there's no other questions, now, are you going to share your PowerPoint or no?
I wasn't going to share it, but I was going to send resources. If you feel that, you're looking at developing a PowerPoint or working on something, you can reach out to me and I can share some slides, but we don't normally share PowerPoints.
Okay.
But I do want to say one thing though, Sarah. I do have in the chat box a message.
Oh, okay.
And then I'll make it quick, I promise. It's from Joanne.
No rush. There's no rush at all.
We have a very diverse population. Do you have any input? There are over 120 counties registered at the high school. So, Joanna, I just have a question. When you're saying about talking about domestic violence and substance use disorder, oh, countries. Okay, so you're asking about how to get that information out there to the different countries so it's all inclusive? Okay, great. I just want to make sure. I want to clarify that. That's a great question. I mean, it's going to be tough, but what I think we need to do, and this is just my opinion, is, we need to be more inclusive. We need to bring other people, like I talked about collaboration, bring people from different agencies, from different walks of life, that have been in domestic violence relationships, that have, substance use disorders, hearing what they have to say and getting it out there that way, because it's not one person that's going to be able to get that out there. It's all of us. We're all equals. We all need to spread the word, do what we need to do. So just kind of reaching out, and even certain nationalities, certain religion, things like that, bringing them on board and talking to them, because they're the ones that can bring it back to their community, to their group. If I walk in and talk, that I probably wouldn't be one in one ear and out the other. So just bringing everybody on board and just spreading awareness and doing it that way. So I hope that answers your question. Well, I think that's it, Sarah. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. Oh, wait a minute. We got a couple more.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Renee. And
yep.
For the outside, and just email me, sopolinsky@wedecinc.org. Yeah, thanks a lot, Renee. And
thanks, Renee, that was great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Everyone have a good day. Enjoy the
All right, take care. Enjoy the weather.
You too. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.